It was a quiet autumn night, and I was driving back home after a long day at work. I took the back roads, a winding route through dense woods, to avoid traffic. There were hardly any other cars around, just the occasional pair of headlights flickering in the distance. I liked the solitude, it gave me time to clear my head. But that night, something felt off. About halfway through the drive, I noticed a car in my rearview mirror. It was a beat-up sedan, its headlights dim and uneven. It followed closely, matching every turn I took. At first, I brushed it off, maybe it was just someone heading in the same direction. But as the miles ticked by, I started to get uneasy. No matter how much I sped up or slowed down, the car remained glued to my tail. I decided to take a random left turn onto an unmarked dirt road, hoping to lose them. The road was rough and narrow, barely wide enough for one vehicle, with thick trees on both sides. But the car followed, its tires crunching over the gravel just a few feet behind me. I drove further into the woods, panic rising in my chest. The road ended in a small clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they blocked out the moonlight. I had no choice but to stop. I kept the engine running, heart pounding, and stared at the rearview mirror. The car stopped a short distance away, its headlights off, leaving me in near total darkness. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, the car door creaked open. A man stepped out, but I could only see his silhouette. He stood there, motionless, just watching me. I could feel his eyes on me, even from that distance. I fumbled for my phone, but there was no signal this deep in the woods. The man took a step closer, then another, slowly closing the gap between us. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there. I slammed the car into reverse, nearly hitting a tree as I spun the wheel, and sped back down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the main road again, where I finally lost sight of him. I never took those back roads again. A few weeks later, I read about a body found in that same stretch of woods, a missing person, last seen being followed by a car fitting the description of the one that tailed me. The police never found the driver. I still wonder what would have happened if I hadn't driven away when I did. Would I have ended up like that missing person? Sometimes, the silence of those back roads still haunts me. A few years ago, I was living in a small apartment in the city. It was an old building with thin walls, so you could hear almost everything happening in the neighboring units. I was used to the usual noises, people talking, footsteps above, doors opening and closing. But one night, something different caught my attention. It started with a tapping sound, soft but consistent, coming from the wall behind my bed. It was rhythmic, like someone gently knocking. I assumed it was just a neighbor, maybe hanging something up, and tried to ignore it. But the tapping didn't stop. It went on for hours, long after I expected people to be asleep. Curious and slightly annoyed, I knocked back. The tapping paused for a moment, then resumed, but now it was louder, more deliberate. It felt like someone was responding to me. Unease settled in my stomach, but I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually fell asleep. The next night, the tapping returned, starting around the same time. This time, it was accompanied by a faint whispering, like someone speaking directly into the wall. I pressed my ear against the wall, trying to make out what was being said, but it was just unintelligible murmurs. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe it was a couple arguing, or someone watching TV late at night. I told myself there was a logical explanation. But as the days went on, the noises got worse. The tapping turned into scraping, like nails dragging across the wall. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, but I still couldn't understand a single word. One night, desperate to figure out what was going on, I went next door to ask my neighbor if they were hearing the same thing. When I knocked, an elderly woman answered. She looked confused when I asked her about the noises. "I live alone," she said, shaking her head. "And I'm deaf in one ear. I wouldn't hear anything even if there was something." Chilled, I decided to let it go and try to ignore the sounds after that. But they never stopped. In fact, they got worse. The tapping grew erratic, the whispering turned into what sounded like soft crying. I was losing sleep, constantly on edge, waiting for the noises to start every night. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I moved out, leaving the apartment behind. A few months later, I heard that the elderly woman had passed away. The new tenant who moved in after her didn't last long either. Rumor had it they complained about strange noises, tapping, whispering, and even someone scratching at the walls. I don't know what was really behind those sounds, but I'm glad I left when I did. Some things are better left unexplained. When I was a teenager, I worked part-time at a small grocery store in my town. It was a quiet place, especially during the late shifts. Most nights, it was just me and the store manager, a guy named Paul, who spent most of his time in the back office. My job was simple: stock shelves, ring up customers, and keep the place tidy. One night, it was particularly slow. By 9 p.m. the store was empty, and I was just counting down the minutes until closing. I was straightening up the aisles when I noticed a man standing near the back of the store, staring at the freezer section. He was tall, with a heavy coat and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. Something about him put me on edge. He wasn't shopping, he just stood there, motionless. I glanced over at the security monitor near the register and saw that Paul was still in the office. I figured he was watching the cameras, so I tried not to worry. But as the minutes dragged on, the man didn't move. He kept his eyes fixed on the freezer, not even blinking. I decided to approach him, thinking maybe he needed help. "Can I help you find something, sir?" I asked, forcing a smile. He didn't respond. He just slowly turned his head to look at me. His face was gaunt, eyes hollow like he hadn't slept in days. I could see his breath fogging up in the cold air. There was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was studying me. I backed away and returned to the front of the store, where I could see Paul through the office window. I signaled for him to come out, but he waved me off, clearly not interested. I was starting to feel a little trapped, alone out there with this strange man. Then, without a word, the man turned and walked out of the store. I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. But when I looked outside, he was standing just beyond the glass doors, staring in at me. He didn't move, just stood there in the shadows, watching. I ran to the office and told Paul what was going on. He finally came out, but by the time he did, the man was gone. Paul brushed it off as a loiterer, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The next night, the same man came back, this time standing in the exact same spot by the freezers. He didn't buy anything, didn't interact with anyone, just stood there for nearly an hour before leaving. It happened a few more times over the following weeks. Each time, he stayed longer, and each time, he got closer to the front of the store, inch by inch. I finally asked Paul if he had any idea who this guy was. Paul said he'd reviewed the security tapes and found something strange: the cameras never recorded the man entering or leaving the store. He just appeared. We never saw him on the footage until he was already inside. After that, I quit the job. I didn't want to stick around long enough to find out what that man wanted or why he kept coming back. But sometimes I still think about him, wondering if he ever found what he was looking for, or who. Love these stories? Listen to these 1 hour of horror stories told in the rain. Click on the video on the screen.